I know this thing is on, and I know that you can hear me. Nursing and healthcare needs advocates and activism. So what are you waiting for? Let's do the damn thing. Hi, and welcome to the Gritty Nurse podcast, an unfiltered discussion related to health and healthcare. My name is Amie Archibald, and I am the Gritty Nurse. So today we're talking about a very important subject. We talked about it previously, but I think it's time to kind of return to this conversation. So typically the hospital floor is a place of healing, but what happens when that very place in that system that's meant to protect patients and nurses becomes a source of pain and injustice? So today we're diving into a landmark case that has the entire healthcare world talking. It's a story of a nurse, DonQuenick Joppy, who went from being a dedicated caregiver to being a victim of what the jury called racial discrimination and retaliation. After being falsely accused of a crime and fighting for her career and her reputation, a Colorado jury has awarded her a staggering $20 million in a verdict. This is not just about money. It's about a nurse who stood up against a powerful hospital corporation and won. So on this episode of The Gritty Nurse, we are interviewing Jerry Soucy, who's a registered nurse, writer, illustrator, and is most notably known for his blog and the persona of the death nurse. His work focuses on palliative and hospice care, and he uses his writing and comic illustrations to discuss end-of-life issues with a unique and often dark sense of humor. And he's also a healthcare justice advocate and an anti-racism ally. So, welcome to the show, Jerry.
Thanks very much, Amie. Very happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. And I think before we get into the case, I think it's important that we talk a little bit about you. I gave like a quick summary that I found, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about who you are as an individual and as a nurse.
Okay, sure. Let's see. I'm 70 years old. I'm in my 50th year as a registered nurse.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's been an interesting ride, and certainly over the last, say, 6 or 8 years in particular. I'm a widow. I was caregiver for my wife, Jean, who was also a nurse educator. She died in January of 2016, and I spent 2 years as her full-time caregiver, at home, not working. Prior to that, I worked in hospice in the community. I worked in critical care, specialty critical care at a teaching hospital, as well as general critical care in a couple community hospitals. I also spent a decent amount of time in my nursing career as a software salesperson, selling software products into healthcare, into hospital departments. I've got 2 grandchildren, 2 grown children, both married, kind of where we are at the moment, I guess.
Well, how did you get into this whole, this death nursing persona? Like, how did that kind of come out? Because I remember actually, I think it was maybe actually 4 years ago, I kind of got onto your profile and I was like, oh, this guy's dope. He's like saying it how it is. And really, I think it's really refreshing because a lot of nurses who would be your age don't have that speak, right? You know what I'm saying? They're not very gritty. They play by the rules, but you play by a different beat of a drum.
Well,
And I think that's important.
I've always liked comedians.
All right.
And I've always liked cartoons. And I think, cartoons and comics are very powerful storytelling tools.
Absolutely.
I don't want to take up too much time with the death nurse thing, but, the persona, the image, I based that on Snoopy in the cartoon strip Peanuts.
Right.
And with the same idea that Snoopy is not a dangerous person. Snoopy's not a scary character. And so neither was this character here. But, I think every nurse, Amie, is a death nurse, or every nurse has an opportunity to practice death nursing, because no matter what the setting, you come in contact with death in some ways, sometimes very directly, sometimes less so. But, if you're dealing with people, you're going to deal with death in some form.
That's true.
So,
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I think it's probably one of the areas of healthcare that a lot of people shy away from. And I wouldn't even say just in healthcare, just in general. Like, I have another podcast, Atypical, where we talk about life's uncertainties. And we just actually recently we're talking about death. And it's like asking that question. It's like, oh, have you completed your will? And it's like, no, but I'll get there. So it's definitely an important conversation.
Love it. Absolutely.
But let's talk about the case. One of the questions that I have for you just off the top is, how did you get involved? I remember kind of seeing it being posted and kind of seeing conversations, but how did you get involved with the case?
Yeah. I met DonQuenick in December of 2021, and it was in the old days of Twitter, right? Nurse Twitter.
Yep.
and it was in a Twitter Spaces.
Right.
I
Wow.
think it might even have been like a Sunday evening or something like that. But Patrick McMurray, Nurse Pat Mac, had organized it. And, a lot of people came, and spoke and stuff. And DonQuenick came and spoke and talked about what was happening to her. And at
Right.
that time, that was 2.5 years after the events at the hospital. So after she was terminated.
Oh, yeah.
So in those 2.5 years, she had been unhoused, COVID pandemic, and, trying to scrape together some way to make enough to be able to live somewhere. And so she came and she described a couple of the big pieces of this incredibly kind of layered and complicated story. It's complicated and it's also very simple and straightforward.
Right.
But so she described that. And then one of the participants they went offline and talked some more because she had documentation. She had screenshots. She had court documents.
Right.
And so we kind of gathered afterwards and got the rest of the story and kind of took off from there. Stayed in touch, supported her in whatever ways we could. And that kind of led into 2022.
Right.
And, one thing that I think is important to point out is that I knew about DonQuenick's case, or I knew about the manslaughter charges that were dismissed. And, one thing about those charges that were dismissed, they were dismissed, and the quote is, in the interest of justice. Now,
Right.
that's not a lofty reason, okay? I mean, I think that was kind of like the first reaction, like, oh my goodness, in the interest of justice, this case should be dismissed. Now, that could be the case in the case of the judge deciding to dismiss the case, but this case was dismissed. It was a motion to dismiss by the prosecutor. In other words, the same office that brought the charges then moved to dismiss the charges in the interest of justice, which was, in that context, its lawyers speak for this case this should not take a moment of the court's time. This is nonsense.
Right.
In the interest of justice, we should just dispose of it, get it away. So, but she had manslaughter charges hanging over her head for a year, had been to a number of hearings, had a public defender, had some pressure to, strike a plea bargain and plead guilty to what? So what I got from that kind of first encounter was a picture in my mind, a really stark picture of a bunch of nurses ganging up on another nurse.
Yeah.
And the images were of people kind of huddled in the hallway, whispering, or kind of like turning their backs on someone when they approached, and
Right.
kind of doing the kinds of sabotage and undermining on a daily basis that really wears people down. And I could see it. And so that kind of led forward. I mean, it
Right.
was, to me, it was very believable. To a lot of people, the story was confusing or messy, or they didn't believe, or whatever. But it was very believable for me. And that kind of, got played out a couple of weeks ago at the trial. But this was a trial where DonQuenick sued the hospital. Yeah, that was a 7-day jury trial. And what I saw there and I think what the jury saw, were two very different versions of nursing, two
Right.
very different visions of what nursing is about.
Mm.
And, for the hospital side, what they presented, I thought, was very rigid, dogmatic, narrow-minded, contrived. The idea of, oh, you violated a policy. Well, what's the policy? Well, here's one over here that it's good enough. You violated this policy that actually applies to another department. So, the whole vision of nursing from the hospital side. And, we need to point out that this is a magnet hospital. This hospital that was dragged in court, has been certified 4 times by the Credentialing Center, the American Nurses Credentialing Center.
Right.
So, in 2004, in 2014, in 2019, when these events that were discussed at trial were all coming down, the hospital was also undergoing a magnet recertification. So they had
Interesting.
to fill out. Well, yeah, they had to, fill out some forms and pay some money to have people walk through. And what
Right.
came out at trial, one of the participants from the hospital side, the critical care nurse, the ICU manager, was really, had a very difficult time over like a year and a half with short staffing and these mean girls run amok. That was the essential story here. It was just a gang run amok. And so by like May of 2019, he was beat and he resigned and said, listen, I'm going to take a staff nurse position somewhere else in the hospital. But they asked him to stay at his desk as the manager until the surveyors from the magnet
We're
surveyors
done.
had come and gone.
I see.
So, I point that out because, the push is that these hospitals are with this designation are somehow special and have a supportive environment for nurses where nurses can be the best they can be and where the patient care is the best and all that stuff. And, what they presented at trial was the exact opposite of that. It was really chaotic, long-term chaotic situation, short staffing, lots of very kind of like quick, abrupt resignations of people at various levels. So you had like someone who came in at the director level who like suddenly was gone. So now they're scrambling to find an interim director for that. So it was just chaos.
Right.
In the midst of this chaos was this mean girl culture, this kind of core group of charge nurses and wannabes and hangers on. And there were some guys involved. And, they basically used their authority in setting up assignments and in making people's schedules to really, really direct a lot of hostile behavior at DonQuenick. So, that, and again, when I say, kind of narrow-minded, I mean, I guess the best way to describe the two visions is for the hospital side, they presented really a bunch of novice nurse thinkings on the whole
Right.
novice to expert continuum, that the thinking was very black and white, was very rote, was very kind of disconnected from the real world, was, as I mentioned, to a substantial degree, kind of like made up on the fly,
Right.
or made up after the fact. With all the claims, and the hospital plans to appeal this verdict, by the way.
Really, I do know that there are some listeners that actually don't know about the case, which to you and me might be surprising, but there are some nurses that don't really know about the case. They might see about the fact that this nurse was awarded $20 million, but they don't actually know what actually transpired. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit, like a high level overview of what we know before the courts transpired?
Sure. I mean, what DonQuenick faced, DonQuenick was employed there for 2 years, from June of 2017 to June of 2019. And, she arrived there very enthusiastic, very much interested in learning, very committed and dedicated to patients. I mean, and getting a lot of favorable feedback from patients. The unit was getting favorable feedback. She was nominated for Daisy Awards on three separate occasions. Then, about a year or so into it, as this kind of new clique started kind of forming, she started facing really a pattern of escalating harassment. And, some of it took the form of really unsafe assignments off like in a distant part of the unit by herself, giving her 3 patients,
In an ICU.
in an ICU, giving her 2 patients, both withdrawing from alcohol, both in 4-point restraints, giving her 2 ventilated patients, both pronated.
That's wild.
And doing this, and when she would approach the charge nurses who were, putting the schedule together, they chuckled, laughed. It was like a game for them.
Right.
And so she was kind of dealing with this, also trying to get some support from the nurse manager, going to the nurse manager, and other nurses were going to human resources, were quitting, were
Right.
going to the managers and just saying, hey, the environment here is really horrible. But nothing was done. I mean, one of the things about mean girls is nobody wants to stand up to them. So, the harassment got worse, and the targeting got more intense, to the point where, after she approached like the head mean girl and said, can I talk to you? And DonQuenick has a way of talking to people. It's very sincere. She always starts off with like several positive things.
Right.
And not like made up positive things, but, commenting on someone's outfit and, thanking them for something they did recently, recognizing their hard work, leading up to saying, why is it that when I talk to you, you're sharp? And the response was, well, what do you mean sharp? And, you're not warm. And they just moved. Not only did they just kind of storm away or walk away, she got written up for it.
Yeah, I'm sure they knew what they were doing.
Exactly. I mean, I think the story is simple in that a lot of Black nurses could look at any piece of this and just say, yeah, that's happened. And, but what it all came down to was one 7 to 7 shift, one night shift. She worked permanent nights. At about like 5:30 in the morning, she got a call saying, you've got 2 patients, discharge one to the step down, turn over the room because you're getting this patient from the ED. Patient from the ED, they kind of went down the list, severe septic shock, ventilated, on these pressors, age 93. And she's like, okay, I got to kind of like go down and see this. Right. And so, she went down to see the patient, and the patient at that point had been in the hospital in the ED for probably like 6 or so hours. And his story to that point was a story of bad decisions by hospital staff. He arrived in an ambulance with a DNR, and his power of attorney was with him.
Right.
She said they got to the ED and he was whisked away. She didn't see him again till she saw him in the ICU. Right. And, they went full bore on this patient with an advance directive.
Which makes no sense.
Which is kind of like, yeah, what happened here?
Right.
And so, I mean, this guy was intubated. He had a central line, an IJ central line. He had a femoral art line. He was on, pressors plus, fluid boluses plus all kinds of nonsense. And I say nonsense because, these are all very aggressive, life-sustaining interventions.
Yeah, he sounds like he was on his way out, and he had, like you said, advanced directives. So it sounds very bizarre to me that all of this was happening. But
exactly. And, just to kind of flesh out the picture a little bit more, I mean, he had been declining at home with a caregiver for a number of years, and then more aggressively over the last number of months. And then in the days prior was increasingly lethargic and non-responsive. And so he was dying at home. And the caregiver panicked, called 911, and, they went full bore. So when DonQuenick cleared the room and went to go down and get a bedside report on the patient and get her eyes on him, it was this real conflict. Like, okay, we're very aggressively treating this very debilitated man whose labs, for all those ICU nurses out there, he had a serum lactate of 13 when he came in, and it was almost 20
at the time. Wow.
So, this was a dying body. But what the hospital chose to do was, or what happened next was, DonQuenick brings the patient up to the ICU, has all these orders for the sepsis protocol and all these aggressive measures. They're short-staffed. Her charge nurse has an assignment, so she's got people kind of pitching in to help out, right? I mean, an admission at 6 o'clock in the morning. And the niece, the power of attorney, the caregiver, wants to come into the room. And because she hasn't seen the guy since they wheeled him away in the ED. And she comes into the room and, she's overwhelmed by all the machines he's by. And she's like, he wouldn't want this. What's going on? And so now DonQuenick is faced with, okay, I've got orders for life-sustaining treatment, but the family wants to redirect care. I got to get some physicians in here to talk to the family member and to give some new orders. So that's kind of, they're trying to make that happen. Shift is changing. The daytime ICU attending comes in and does talk to the niece and then gives orders, says, okay, just continue all the pressors, take them off the vent, Here's some med orders, comfort meds if you need them. Yeah, we're changing direction. And so that's kind of the clinical scenario. And the thing is, with someone who's basically, you know, in the advanced stages of actively dying, when you do things like turn off the pressors, it all kind of unravels fast.
Yep.
So she called for help. She called respiratory therapy, and the guy said, "Oh, I'm in rounds. I can't be there for 45 minutes or so."
Right.
Tried to get the charge nurse's attention. She went over to the other part of the unit a couple times. I mean, it was really kind of like, we've got an emergency here. We've got a rapidly evolving situation.
Right.
And it's not like we can park him for an hour.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so when nobody was responding, she called the respiratory therapist again and said, "Listen, this guy is dying with or without us. Alarm's going off." She says, "How do I turn off the vent?" And so he gave her instructions on how to turn off the vent, which she did, and stayed with the family member. And a couple minutes after that, the respiratory therapist comes into the room and disconnects the vent from the patient who's still intubated. And, that's kind of how things go. And later in the day, what kind of evolved out of this mean girl clique was really building this event into, oh my goodness, she touched the ventilator. She turned off the ventilator. The patient was alive. The patient was breathing. In doing that, she suffocated him. That's breaking policy and all this stuff. So, kind of after this long string of events in this guy's care that were mistakes, that were the potential sources of suffering, they kind of decided, well, let's make this particular event the one that we focus on. So they used it as, the pretense to fire her. When they were working up their internal investigation, their sham investigation, DonQuenick was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And she reached out to corporate human resources and to their kind of like, helplines saying, I think there's this mess going on. I don't really understand what they're all about, but I feel concerned and that I'm being targeted as a woman of color. So, what her lawyers pointed out at the trial was that, that's a red flag for anybody in human resources. And they didn't do anything in response to that. In fact, that kind of speeded
everything
things up to like, okay, let's wrap this up and get rid of her. So a couple things came out of this. In addition to the termination, a group of nurses at several levels essentially constructed a false story that they turned into the Department of Public Health and Environment in Colorado. And they turned it in because this isn't just an incident report within the hospital. This is potential abuse and neglect. And they turned it into the state. Department of Public Health gets something like that, and
they're going to do something about it.
Yeah, they read into it and they say, well, nurse involved, this has got to go to the Board of Nursing. And oh my goodness, there's claims here of suffocation and drowning and causing suffering. This goes to the Attorney General. So that's how kind of like the criminal charges came about. That's how her license was investigated, for a period of time. And that was kind of like, the last straw as far as like how much we could pile on someone. So that all came. So the events at the hospital were in 2019. The criminal charges from the Attorney General's office were in 2020, so a year later, and they hung over her for a year before being dismissed. And so that's when, again, when I first met DonQuenick in late 2021. Subsequent to that, she did, in addition to having a public defender, there was another attorney who stepped forward looking at the whole case saying that this isn't right and referred her to an attorney experienced in employment law, discrimination and retaliation cases. And she looked at the information at hand, and that included a whole bunch of discovery materials, including the whole medical record that the hospital provided to the Attorney General back related to, those criminal charges. So they had a lot of material to look through, and the picture that emerged was like, yeah, this is, escalating levels of discrimination, and the timing, the chronology of filing a complaint, essentially, kind of like raising a concern and having it be ignored. It all kind of made sense to her attorney as a case. So that turned into, in April of 2022, she filed a lawsuit against the hospital.
Yeah.
Now, the hospital is, in addition to being a magnet hospital, and they also got their fourth magnet just last year. So a couple years after being named in a discrimination suit, get their recertification. They're also a DAISY customer, the hospital is. So the idea of promoting positive regard, and the fact that here's someone who was recognized 3 times by different people.
Right.
It's kind of like, you could almost imagine this kind of thing happening at like a bottom of the barrel hospital. But, when you're talking about a hospital that presents itself as, one of the best, it really, really doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, have you heard of the saying that you can put lipstick on a pig, but it
Yeah.
still is a pig?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think you kind of know what I mean. You're mentioning about this magnet designation and how hospitals have to go. Like here in Canada, it's called accreditation. It's a similar process. But again, for someone who worked in quality improvement, I could tell you that it's this rush and this scramble to get these check marks done. But on the, if you scratch a little bit harder, like none of the real work has been done. And it's very concerning because again, like I think there's a lot of work that needs to be had with just that. But the other piece is the fact that, we have a whole culture and we don't do a very good job. Like we talk about nursing, bullying, and lateral violence and incivility, but this is much more insidious. This is not just, incivility or bullying or harassment. Like there's racism here. And I, as a Black nurse, like just you telling me, and I actually know a DonQuenick story because like as a Black nurse, it's something that we can all kind of connect to, that we've all had those experiences where there's that click. And for whatever reason, well, we know what the reason is. We're getting these unfair assignments, this treatment, in terms of, not being supported or not showing support. And then when, shit hits the fan, we're the first ones that are being thrown under the bus. And it sounds exactly like what happened with her as well. And I think that, one of the it just makes me so angry because I know one of the other things is there are a lot of opportunities for organizations to get on board, for them to show support, for them to, speak out or speak in solidarity with. And I remember here it was like radio silent.
Yeah.
A few
Absolutely.
advocates here and there that were speaking about DonQuenick's case, but nobody from these large associations were saying anything. I remember actually pulling out a quote here. I got to read it and this was from one of the first cases so the medical center of Aurora was like, well, the same claim is without merit and is a tactic by a disgruntled former colleague. And it's just like, how frustrating it is to be in a system where, you're supposed to be supported, where there's supposed to be people that, we're all nurses. We are all, doing the same thing. We all want to see better patient healthcare outcomes. But there's this other piece of nursing, like you mentioned, there's this kind of duality where it's just like, the profession itself is rotten to the core, where we haven't dealt with our own internal issues and we haven't had a reckoning with the racism that we do see within the nursing profession. I remember seeing the articles, but it was more of this is the story, this is the statement, but not solidarity or how we can help support this individual, which makes me question the entire system because again, I know that it's never one person. You outlined so many different things in terms of what went wrong or what could have been done differently. But it's always interesting how even hospitals, because they say, oh, we're working on systems issues, how they were very quick to point at one individual when I saw red flags just from you telling me and from reading that there were multiple system issues. So I know one of the things that you were kind of just about to talk about was kind of the verdict. So do you want to kind of expand on what has happened since 2021?
If we go back to, so April 2022 the suit was filed, and the other side, basically the strategy was to just kind of delay and throw in a lot of steps. The process of discovery, where you take testimony under oath in depositions, where you look at documents and emails and stuff like that, was prolonged. DonQuenick was deposed on 4 separate occasions. Any of your listeners with any experience in this, and none of us want to have experience in this, being deposed once
is enough. Yeah.
Plenty. This 4 times was extra. And just kind of dragging out the process in the hope that, they just go away, that they give up, raising all kinds of objections. Only in the United States, one thing to explain, because you've got a lot of Canadian listeners too, this was tried in U.S. District Court. This was federal court. The claim that DonQuenick brought was brought under a part of the United States Code that goes back to just after the Civil War and Civil Rights Act of 1866. And that law states that came after the abolition of slavery. But the idea was, so people can no longer be enslaved, but if they can't participate in commerce, if they can't make contracts and get contracts enforced, then so this law basically said, anybody in the United States has the same rights for contracts and enforcing them, et cetera, as a white citizen. And so, the claim was that the hospital and that people at the hospital targeted DonQuenick because of her race and retaliated against her because she complained about being discriminated against.
Right.
And so it did go to trial. In U.S. federal court, about 1% of cases filed, civil cases filed, ever get to trial.
Right. Wow.
People reach a settlement, or it gets dismissed for various reasons, or you get summary judgment where the judge says, okay, we're not going to trial, but these are my findings and this is where we end it. So getting to trial was significant. And the trial itself, I think the trial itself came down to this 2 competing visions of what's nursing and what does a nurse do. And, the hospital's continued claim is that, what nurses do is, very, very narrowly prescribed, and we really don't think of the larger context, like the fact that this wasn't a living patient, which is what they keep emphasizing. This wasn't a living patient. You and I are living. This was a dying man. And the only reason that, he wasn't dead yet was because they intervened to kind of prevent that. I think this is really worth kind of staying with that. Like, what is a nurse? Who is a nurse, and what is nursing? And their vision of nursing would have DonQuenick tell the power of attorney, we can't do anything for 45 minutes until the respiratory therapist gets here, so we're just going to sit here and wait. And in fact, in their write-up of her termination, they said that she stayed to provide
2 hours,
unnecessary care. And like I said, this was a rapidly changing situation. So the hospital's vision of nursing, this magnet nursing, is very rule bound. It's very punishment oriented. Even at trial, when the whole thing was presented as a possible learning opportunity, and the other side just kind of scoffed at that, like, learning opportunity. We're talking about a living patient, and we're talking about a terrible mistake. And, the whole thing was very, I guess I come back to something that Katie Boston Leary at the American Nurses Association said one time. And she said, Black nurses just are not shown the same grace when it comes to education, when it comes to practice, In one setting, the fact of discrimination was proved at trial by the fact that DonQuenick was singled out for the most extreme form of punishment, termination, and everybody else involved in that specific clinical incident got nothing.
Which is wild. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And again, I look at that clinical situation, there's so many things to be learned there. They just made it into, they turned it into a weapon. They turned this dying man into a weapon. The jury, in seeing kind of that vision of nursing compared with, what DonQuenick was there as a nurse, and she was on the stand for 4 hours, and she did great. I mean, in terms of dealing with the other side's attorney, who was very aggressive in his questioning. I mean, the only case that they had was to make her the problem.
Right.
And so they threw everything out there that they could, every kind of trope that you would associate with Black women.
Interesting.
And really didn't deal with the facts of the case beyond turned off the ventilator of a living intubated patient. I mean, it was like a mantra, the other side, just their robotic repetition of these kind of buzzwords that really don't have any meaning versus, DonQuenick. One of the things that came out was the mean girls, the charge nurses and stuff, and the hospital had actually implemented a program called ESL.
ESL.
ESL, and it's not English as a second language. It's
Okay.
exceptional, solid, or low performer.
What?
Yeah. So what they were
exceptional,
yeah,
solid, low performer.
or low performer. So you could, as a staff nurse, you could be rated without your knowledge. You could be rated at one of these three. And it's kind of a subjective thing. It's like, what the charge nurses do. They get together and they talk about. And so, one of the things that happened after DonQuenick approached, this charge girl was that she was labeled a low performer. She was
There was no record of her ever being a low performer.
No, her evaluation, her performance evaluation after 1 year was really good. It was met expectations down the line and some very positive things, very positive comments. And so, but this thing about low performers is they identified DonQuenick and a couple of others as low performers. They never told them that, oh, by the way, we have this rating system and you're rated low performer and here's our plan to help you.
Right.
It was just this secret thing that you had hanging over your head. There's more.
Unbelievable.
The trial itself was just like a postdoctoral seminar. The burden of proof in a case like this, DonQuenick was the plaintiff, so she's acting as the prosecutor. She's making the claim, and the hospital is defending itself against the claim. And in a civil case, the burden of proof is for the jury by a preponderance of evidence. Not beyond a reasonable doubt, not like 99% sure, but more like 51-49.
Right.
If it's 51-49, well, it goes to the 51%, And the judge's instructions, I remember her saying, you can't really speculate on whether or not someone possibly did something. It's not about what's possible, but you can connect dots and say that something was probable. And the jury saw these two versions of nursing. They deliberated one short afternoon, and then came back the following morning for like another 3 or 4 hours, and then rendered a verdict. And in federal court, the verdicts are unanimous, have to be unanimous. Otherwise, it's a, hung jury mistrial.
Right.
And, there were 9 members of the jury. None of them were Black. I think 4 women and 5 men, or maybe 3 women and 6 men. But they were very clear. The questions to them were, did DonQuenick prove by a preponderance of evidence that the hospital discriminated against her? And they said yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And then did she prove with a preponderance of evidence that they retaliated against her for engaging in protected activity, for reporting discrimination? They said yes. And they said, well, should she be compensated? And they said yes, $5 million. And then should the hospital be punished? And they said yes, with a fine of $15 million. So that's how you get to the 20 million total.
Yeah. I think about all of what we've talked about, and and the verdict that she was awarded the $5 million plus the 15, but I still feel like justice is not served. Like, it makes me wonder, okay, so these other nurses, these other players that pretty much concocted this entire situation get to continue to go to work with, probably no consequence. They don't have to worry about their reputation being ruined. I've not seen their names in any newspapers or anything like that. They didn't have to lose their home. I remember speaking to Amanda Galino at one point in time and asking how DonQuenick was, and to find out that she was homeless or precariously housed. And I was just like, what is going on? So for me, it's just kind of like, although that settlement of the finances are going to be there, and again, I don't know how it works in the States in terms of paying it out. I
Well, I
still
mean, she
feel like
got
it's
a verdict. She didn't get a check.
right. And that's the other piece. And I think that's important for people to know. It's like this is the ruling, but there's still the dinero's not there. And I think that's what, to have that sense of feeling like, one, that she's not being gaslit, that she knows that what she was saying was true and it was happening to her, and other people agreed that it was happening to her. That validation, I think, is hugely important.
Yeah,
But
it
I
is.
feel like there's still so much more that needs to be done, right? I think that I know that this is going to happen again. We're going to see something similar like this. And I know that I get these messages all the time from Black nurses talking to me about these cases that they have of, or instances where, they're gaslit, but really what's happening to them is racism in healthcare. So I just feel like there's so much more that needs to be done. And we just have to continue holding people accountable. Like, it shouldn't have to get to the point where someone's homeless, someone is fighting for 4 or 5 years of their life to prove the fact that racism and discrimination actually occurred, to the fact that, her life was essentially ruined.
It's definitely been interrupted in major ways, and it's had ripples. I mean, she's a mother,
Yep.
she's a daughter. She's been separated from her family. She's missed, I mean, it's been 6 years. And so that's a lot in a kid's life. I think, for my purposes, I mean, the piece that's when we do discuss racism in nursing, to me, it's always done in ways that, okay, let's not offend anybody. Someone wrote a piece about this case recently, and I read through it, and you really don't get the fact that this was about a Black nurse being mobbed at work
Right.
by a bunch of white nurses, and not just like a bunch of coworkers, but people in responsible positions all the way up to the director level.
Right.
I don't know what it's going to take for people, and I'm talking about like the dominant demographic and nurses, to be able to just like sit with that truth. Like, hey, guess where the problem is, or where the biggest part of the problem is. If you're talking about racism in nursing and you look at nursing's demographics, it's like, okay, where's the largest source of the problem? Where's the most intensive source of the problem?
Right.
And, I think, there's a lot of myths associated with nursing. There's a lot of mythology, and, the racist lady with the lamp is just one of them. This idea of angelic, selfless caregivers and stuff. Nurses are people. And in the United States, if there's 5.2 million registered nurses, I'm going to say that there's, some substantial percentage of them that you don't want taking care of you, or people in your families. You just don't. And I'm going to put that at like about 25%. Um, the first myth to kind of like get over is, I think nurses got to get over themselves. We got to get over ourselves, that we're deeply flawed, and that we build and maintain these deeply flawed systems, that we recognize people and we recognize organizations that, all they're doing is filling out forms and writing a check. There's nothing. So it's a really kind of messy, nasty, corrupted system. Sorry to say that as a 70-year-old guy.
No, but it's important to hear, and I think this is kind of a good point to say, okay, so where do we go from now? You kind of touched on some things and touched on the fact that, and I've said too, like nursing does need a reckoning and a full overhaul, because, and I think it starts really right at the educational level, right? When you're coming into nursing, again, I think we need to see different leadership. I've said that time and time again, and I will say it over and over, that some of the leaders that we have in some of these positions of power and authority are the ones that are kind of continuing some of the more negative aspects of nursing that we continue to see time and time again. So I am definitely for one of those people that I'm like, if we want to see change and we want to see overhaul, then we need to remove the people from some of these roles of power to actually see that change, or
Yeah.
give over power to other people So we
Those
can see that kind of a shift, right?
those positions and an organization like the American Nurses Association isn't there to change things. It's there to keep things,
The
you
same
know,
status quo.
as they are. And you could put different people out front. Um, you could issue statements, but when it comes down to it, that organization in particular is aligned with the defendants in this case. They're not aligned with DonQuenick. They haven't said anything since the verdict.
Which is very interesting too.
It's because it's such a significant case. I mean, it's a big deal in legal circles, I mean, winning a jury trial in legal circles in federal court is a big deal by itself. But to do it in employment discrimination, to have a jury render a verdict of race discrimination, that's a huge deal. And, yeah, they've said absolutely nothing. And I think it's because they're aligned with the defendant. They're aligned with the hospital. The hospital is $1 million customer of theirs. The hospital is owned by, a $95 billion hospital corporation. And if I was selling Magnet, I'd be working that account. I'd be making sure HCA is really happy because they have a lot of hospitals, so I could sell a lot of Magnet programs. So they're in a bad spot, but that's the only way that it makes sense to me that they've said nothing.
Yeah, that's wild. I'm here in Canada and I could fully say, hey, A&A, it is wild that you have not said anything about this case. Like,
Why not?
why have you not said anything?
And what do
If
you
you
have
are
to
an
say?
organization that says that you're there for nurses, you can't be there for some nurses and not there for other nurses. You're either there for nurses or you're there for the money. So we need to know which one it is. Like, I think that's something that needs to be asked. Like, if you say that you're for the profession, then speak out for all nurses. And if that hasn't happened yet, then we should be questioning these institutions and who they're aligned with, and like, follow the money. Maybe that's a part of the problem. But I definitely do
Absolutely
feel that
is.
the leadership is also a part of the problem, which is, it just gets under my skin, because I know at the end of the day that the only person this tends to end up hurting are, racialized individuals, racialized nurses, black women, who continually face these types of pressures in the workplace. Even if we are overperformers, we tend to see that these outcomes are the worst for us. And I think as a black nurse that, the burden shouldn't be shouldered on me as just a black nurse. Like, I mean, of course, I'm going to continue to advocate for myself, but I think the fact that there are allies like you is very helpful. We need other people
Well,
that have skin in the game, that
this
say, this is an injustice.
and this is a white nurse problem. I had a very prominent black nurse look at me and say, "What do you want me to do? Where are the people who should be speaking out? What are they saying about this?" Because yeah, this was a bunch of white nurses. DonQuenick was the last black nurse in the ICU amongst 80 staff.
Well, you know what? I don't blame her. And I'm sure other black nurses see that and say, yep, that is not a place. And it shouldn't have to be like that. But it's just like, you know what? We know not to work there.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what, Jerry? We've got some work to do.
We could go on for a while,
Of course.
and I think we need to. I'll say, this too, that over the last couple of years, and particularly over the last year or so, the ANA put on a series of seminars on racism in nursing, like webinars once a month or a couple times a month from the spring into the summer. And I attended most of them. I think there's one that I missed. And, there were some very good people, very strong people saying important things and things that need to be said that participated in this. But there was a lot of, there was just a lot of this dancing around, what to say and how to say it. And, in the chat, for one thing, I remember somebody put up in the chat, is there a safe space for fragile white nurses to go and kind of, talk about this? Because,
Right.
what is going on? And so, I mean, I think this case certainly is an opportunity to really talk about the real stuff. And it's not about like shaming or beating people over the head.
Right.
It is about truth. It is about facts. The facts of this case are critical. The evidence in this case and what it says about nursing, you got to face facts. But, it's like truth and reconciliation go together, and truth is the first part of it. So, I don't think it's going to come from the big players. I don't think it's going to come from the orgs or even the folks who are out there selling themselves as, experts in this field. It's just too hot. It's going to take smaller players. It's going to take us. I mean, I'll call myself a smaller player, insignificant, really.
Not at all.
But
I would not say that at all. Don't downgrade yourself.
I only have an undergraduate degree, so that immediately
You only have?
brings me.
Don't say that. You say I have an undergraduate degree. Don't.
I'm being
Don't tell yourself.
sarcastic. I'm being sort of sarcastic, but of course, yeah, that stuff matters hugely in enterprise circles and stuff. And again, I think, between the kind of edge influences and the young people, the young nurses, because they're just not going to take any of this bullshit. They're going to look at an organization that's saying nothing about an important case, and they'll put two and two together and draw their conclusions.
It takes one viral post. That's it. One viral TikTok, one conversation, one podcast, sometimes to get the ball rolling. I am a huge believer in the power of grassroots and the fact that just by sharing a story, that also is power. And I'm hopeful that there'll be change. I'm not too sure if the ANA will say anything, but you know what? Maybe we don't need to wait for them. Maybe it's
Right.
something
No,
that
we
we
don't.
continue to do, right?
That's right.
We continue to do the work because we know that maybe that organization's not going to do the work, but we will continue to do the work whether they're there or not. Because again, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we're doing what's right by us. And I think you could probably, you're in the States, so you definitely know and probably can understand and can empathize with me that it's so important right now to say what we mean, to be very directive, to open our eyes to see that we need to have more compassion, to say what we mean and not hold back and feel encumbered by, oh, what's that person going to think? Or, I might get canceled because I'm speaking out on this particular issue. I think our conscience should be our best guide. I think a lot of people are losing that ability to, one, find their conscience, understand the difference between right and wrong, those things that our parents teach us, and to be able to stand in their own selves and to say, you know what? I need to speak my truth. I need to be honest. I need to say that there's a problem. And I feel that the younger generation is coming. It's going to be ugly for some folks, but that's okay. It'll be beautiful for us.
Absolutely.
And I'm ready for it.
Yeah, me too.
So before we close out, I do want to ask one last question, and you can answer it very quickly. How is DonQuenick doing right now?
DonQuenick is good. She's a good
Okay,
person,
good.
so she's good. She's tired, and she's very eager to kind of pick up on some things that she hasn't been able to. And,
Right.
this is a big milestone. So there's that. But I think probably what she really wants to do is like, okay, how can this help other people? Because, she said too, I'm not the only one this is happening to. And so how do we turn things around?
Yeah.
She's very, very deep into scripture. And there's one piece, and it's just the phrase, make all things new. So we've got this thing called nursing. Yeah, it's kind of a mess. Let's make it new.
Right. No, I like that. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So thank you so much, Jerry, for coming on the Greeners podcast and sharing DonQuenick's story again. I think it's important to share these stories and to talk about, the change that we need to see in nursing. And I think that, again, these issues, there's no border, just like there's no border for racism. It's not any better or worse because I'm in Canada. Racism exists here. Issues with nursing exist here. And we just need to be open and talk about it. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing DonQuenick's story. I wish her the best. I'm going to be out here continuing to advocate. Thank you for all of what you've done. I think it's probably time for you to get some rest too.
Yeah, I'm an old man. It's past my bedtime.
It's past your bedtime. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the Greeners podcast. It was an amazing discussion. I'm sure we'll have you back on to have more conversations.
Would love it. I would love it. Thanks
Absolutely.
very much, Amie. Glad
Thank you so
you're
much.
doing this.
Absolutely. Anytime. Looking for a great gift for a nurse or someone who needs to learn about nursing? Check out my national best-selling book, The Wisdom of Nurses, Stories of Grit from the Bedside. Thank you so much for listening to The Gritty Nurse with Amie Archibald-Varley. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or any other podcast platform, please hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss out on any awesome episodes from The Gritty Nurse. Thank you so much, and stay tuned until next time. Stay gritty.